With the Investing News Network, I'm Scott Tibbles. Today I'm reporting from the floor of the International Mining and Resources Conference in Melbourne, Australia, and joining me now is David Thurtell. He is Manager, Resources and Energy with the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science with the Australian Government. Thank you for joining me, David.
Morning, Scott.
So yesterday you had a presentation on the Australian resources industry. Unfortunately, I didn't make it, but for the purpose of our listeners, can you tell me a little bit about what you talked about and how the response was?
Sure. Basically, I talked about a couple of main themes. First one was urbanisation and industrialisation in the world, which populations moving into urban spaces and needing resources, steel, other metals in order to build factories, dwellings, hospitals, schools, train networks, etc. So we'd seen China over the last decade or more urbanise something like 400 million people. That's set to slow slightly to about 16 million people per year from 22 million per year. But other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, also India, they are now starting to urbanise at a similar rate to what China did. So the outlook is for still ongoing strength in demand for, resource and energy commodities. The second part that I talked about was the very, very low per capita energy consumption in some of the world's largest countries, and the potential that if they even went halfway towards consuming the same amount of energy per capita as advanced Western countries, that the demand for energy will be phenomenal. So I guess the outlook is still very strong in the long term for resources and energy demand. The second thing I talked about, I guess, was we've had three sort of main energy transformations. First to coal in the sort of early part of the 1900s, then to oil in the sort of second half, I guess, and then more recently to gas. And that we're looking now at the fourth energy transition, and that is obviously to renewable energy. And what that implies for demand for commodities, particularly those metals used in renewable energy production, such as copper, lithium, nickel, graphite, cobalt, rare earths. So, I guess that's what we see as the next transition in energy, and what the prospects are for different metals, and therefore for demand for Australia.
Okay, and so how is it looking for Australia, just sort of going long for the next 10 years? Is it looking like Australia is well positioned to take advantage of this next transition?
It does. It looks already we are the world's leading lithium producer. In just 3 years, we've essentially just pushed ahead. We've got the advantage that we don't need a sort of second stage of processing, like say in South America, where they have lithium carbonate, which needs to be reprocessed to get it to battery standard. We basically produce lithium hydroxide from hard rock, not from brine, and we have a significant cost advantage. So look, we have large reserves of cobalt, we've got large reserves of nickel, copper, some graphite and other critical minerals, and we think Australia is really well placed to produce more of those metals, which in some way will compensate for probably what is a less optimistic outlook for things like thermal coal.
And so talking about those minerals, so the message, the image of Australia is as a country that mainly digs up and exports iron ore and gold, and these battery metals and such seem to have come out of nowhere. How did the government really moved so quickly to develop Australia's resources on that front?
On the renewable space.
Yes, in renewables.
Look, industry, the government basically tries to enable industry. It tries to sort of, be less of an obstacle in terms of approvals for mining approvals, etc., etc. It tries to sort of get a one-stop shop going so that mining companies can get all their approvals in one fairly quick process. Look, Australia has got a pretty developed financial system. After the mining boom, I think banks and other financiers knew that Australia has become the world's leading miner, in my opinion. We've got great processes, great practices, some very highly skilled workers and workforce. And, in the space of the last 10, 15 years, have demonstrated that there's an opportunity there. We can take advantage of it. I think the industry has combined with the government to sort of quickly develop things like lithium, and we're trying to get up the curve on, critical minerals and other sort of renewable energy sources. We've been quick off the mark, and hopefully we can be equally as quick on some of these other commodities.
And so a lot of that is on the supply side, digging up minerals that the world wants. What about processing? Has Australia been working on its processing capacity, or are we still exporting for that?
Look, we're still largely raw materials. We're still largely exported in raw material form. Look, the government's trying to foster more processing. I guess trying to bring down the cost of electricity and energy is one of the things that they're trying to do to sort of foster that processing step. But look, we've processed our alumina and our bauxite into further stages for decades. Same with copper, same with nickel, same with zinc. So we're not a complete novice when it comes to processing. In fact, it was MIM, one of Australia's oldest mining companies, that pioneered copper cathode processing to get it where it is today. So we have been for decades, if not centuries, at the forefront of processing, and we've done some of our own processing. We send a lot of iron ore over. We find, I guess, the market has found that its comparative advantage is producing the raw ore and exporting it to countries like China to process over there. If that's the most profitable way to do it, then the market, I guess, makes that determination.
Okay, and so speaking of processing, just recently the United States has declared rare earths as a critical mineral, and a lot of other jurisdictions around the world are doing something similar. Australia's in a unique position, being home to the only company outside of China that has any major production capacity. When allies like the United States declare rare earths a critical mineral, has that increased focus on Australia's rare earths industry? Has it increased the opportunity for us as well?
Absolutely. Look, my team has just published a report on critical minerals. Australia, we identified 6 critical minerals that we are in the world's top 6 resource holders. Look, the American government is interested in getting a more diverse supply. Currently, China dominates processing and production of rare earths. And look, it's in everyone's, any business and any company, any consumer in the world wants to have security of supply. And security, normally that's part. You need to get diversity. So Asian power utilities, for instance, for decades have shown that they do not want to get, they do not want to rely on one energy source from one country. They want oil, they want gas, they want nuclear, they want coal, and they want it from a variety of countries. They do not want to just get all their energy from coal from Australia, because when you have a cyclone or where you have a sort of supply disruption, that makes your system vulnerable. So in the similar way, if critical minerals are sort of essential to the world's transitioning to more renewable energy, then it makes sense for any country or any consumer to get a variety of sources of supply, and to develop those different supply sources, not rely on China or one country to get your supply. So it makes perfect sense for America and other countries, such as Germany and Japan, to try and develop Australian resources if they're there.
Okay, and so we've spent a lot of time talking about looking forward for the Australian industry, but this is a question for 2019, I guess. So what would you say was the biggest development or the biggest deal for the Australian minerals industry in 2019? What sort of emerged as the main theme?
Look, I'm not sure that I could point to any one development. I think it's becoming apparent that the role of nickel and copper, which are, we produce in quite significant quantities. In fact, Australia's got the world's largest resources of nickel. We're the sixth largest producer of copper. Copper, there's a huge amounts of copper being used in electric vehicles and hybrids compared to internal combustion engines. There's 5 tons of copper in a wind turbine. So the need for nickel and copper going forward is going to be immense. Same with lithium, cobalt and other sort of renewable type commodities. And we've got significant resources, and we're keen to get those out of the ground and developed to help the world transition to using more renewable power and emitting less carbon. So I think that's a very bright sort of spot on the horizon.
Okay, and so that plays to an outlook question for the next coming years. So instead I'll ask, we've had a bit of a good journey around looking at the different minerals that we produce here in Australia. What would you say is a commodity that perhaps flies under the radar that investors or people looking at Australia thinking to invest could have a closer look at?
I think things like cobalt and graphite are probably the things that people could focus on. Like I said before, their importance, they're essential in some of the batteries. I think some people paint a picture that, the world doesn't have any trouble producing renewable energy. It's the trouble is how to get baseload, how to basically get reliable energy supply. So when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing, how do you store the renewable energy that you have when it has occurred, when the wind has been blowing? And that goes to storage. So it's either with hydro storage or if you can't build dams, then how do you store it in metal, essentially, batteries, whether they're in an electric car or in a home storage battery. If we have batteries in hundreds of millions of cars and hundreds of millions of houses and factories, etc., then those can be enormous stores of temporary power until the sun shines and the wind blows. So I think that's the future. That's the future. How do you store energy? And I guess hydrogen is something that the Australian government's looking very, very closely at, because you can make hydrogen in a number of ways. You can make it out of essentially out of carbon fossil fuels, but you can also use renewable power and water to make hydrogen, and then you store it as a liquid, and then you can transport it around around the world, around the country. So I guess that's, along with hydro and battery storage, hydrogen is another way of harnessing renewable power and then storing that power through electrolysis into hydrogen in a liquid or a gas form.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for taking so much time to have a chat with me, David.
No problem, Scott. Cheers.
And once again, I'm Scott Tibbles with the Investing News Network, and I've been chatting with David Thurtell, who is Manager of Resources and Energy with the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science at the Australian Government.